Alors, bonjour et bienvenue. Je suis Antonia Maioni, présidente de la Fédération canadienne des sciences humaines, et je suis vraiment très contente de vous voir en si grand nombre. Je sais que le soleil brille, ça nous amène à être de bonne humeur, et je suis contente que vous soyez parmi les nôtres ce matin. I'm very pleased to welcome you this morning to the Parliamentary Restaurant for our Big Thinking address with Gordon Betcherman. As many of you know in this room, because you've been at our events before, the Big Thinking lecture is something that's very important to us at the Federation because it's a way of showcasing research in social sciences and humanities, and in addition, bringing that research to the ears and eyes, with technology, of decision makers, policy makers, and opinion leaders such as yourself, who can use this research and information to further discussions and decisions about policies that affect the lives of all Canadians. And much of this research in social sciences and humanities, by its very nature, focuses on critical issues of the day: social, economic, and cultural. Et dans ce contexte, je suis très heureuse de constater que parmi nous ce matin, non seulement on voit nombreux députés et sénateurs du Parlement qui viennent de plusieurs régions de notre pays, mais aussi une diversité impressionnante de représentants des secteurs privés, publics, académiques, ainsi que les ONG. Et je voudrais aussi souligner la présence de plusieurs de nos amis au Conseil de recherche en sciences humaines, le CRSH, les Fonds canadiens d'innovation, CFI aussi, tous les deux des agences clés pour l'avancement et l'engagement du savoir au Canada. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gordon Betcherman, our speaker today, and he'll be addressing an issue that is, of course, on everyone's mind, not only here in Canada but across the world, discussion of the importance of jobs in development. Not only is it important to our daily lives and to the lives of people all over the globe, but it's also a talk that's especially timely given that the SSHRC has recently announced a knowledge synthesis grant in this very area in collaboration with Human Resources and Skills Development Canada and other partners. A professor in the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa, Dr. Betcherman is well known for his expertise in labor economics, demography, and emerging and transition economies. Dr. Betcherman joined the University of Ottawa in 2009 after 11 years with the World Bank in Washington, where he was sector manager and lead economist in the human development sector for Europe and the Central Asia region. He continues to consult the World Bank. We just had breakfast, and he was telling me about his recent visits there. And most recently, he was a member of the core team for the 2013 World Development Report. Today, Dr. Betcherman addresses us on the topic of jobs first, rethinking development around the globe. Monsieur Betcherman.
Merci, Antonia. Et je suis très heureuse d'être ici ce matin. As Antonio mentioned, I'm going to talk about jobs and development. I have to say to start, first of all, I'm really pleased to have gotten this invitation from the Federation to talk this morning in this series, which is, I think, a great event that happens in Ottawa and allows so many different groups to discuss a wide range of topics that are of interest to all of us as Canadians. So I'm really pleased to have been invited by the Federation. I'm also pleased that a number of MPs are here today, and especially pleased that some of my colleagues and students from the University of Ottawa are here as well this morning. So I have to admit it's a bit daunting, especially at 7:45 in the morning, to be lecturing in a series called Big Thinking. But I'm going to do my best, and actually I feel that what I'm going to talk about today, which is inspired by the recent World Development Report, I actually think that there are some new and innovative ideas that come out of that report, and I'm saying that not just because I'm one of the people who wrote the report. I think it offers a different way to look both at jobs and at development. Now, the topic I am talking about today, jobs and development, these are two concepts that actually come together surprisingly infrequently. When people think about international development, jobs rarely take a central place. And think about the Millennium Development Goals that were put in place at the turn of the century to essentially provide the architecture for international development efforts around the world. There was not an explicit goal on jobs, for example. So what we've tried to do in this report is to link these two concepts of jobs and development. And I think it leads us to some very different views on both fronts about jobs and about development itself. So I don't have a lot of time this morning. I want to start really by giving you the three main messages that I wanted to convey in my talk, and then I'll spend the rest of the time getting into a little bit more detail on some of these messages. The first message has to do with the fact that jobs need to become center stage in terms of international development, and in fact, center stage in the policy discussions everywhere, regardless of the country's level of development. Now, they're already center stage in terms of public opinion. Surveys in countries virtually everywhere tend to indicate that people rank jobs as at the top or very near the top of their list of concerns. And jobs are certainly really prevalent in the political discourse. You don't hear election campaigns where jobs are not being talked about all the time. But all of this buzz notwithstanding, when you really take a close look at it, everyone's talking about the need for a jobs agenda, but people don't really put forward jobs agendas. And what I'm going to try to do today is talk a little bit about what that might look like, a real agenda for jobs. The second message I want to convey, and this really provides the rationale for the first message, which was putting jobs center stage. The second message is that jobs need to be recognized as important, not just to the individuals who hold them, but that there's a broad social value to jobs. And certainly from an individual point of view, jobs are important because, after all, that is how we earn a living. But from a society's point of view, jobs are really important too, because it's through jobs that economies develop and prosper, and it's through jobs that societies knit themselves together. So I want to make the argument that for these reasons and for the broad social value of jobs, it needs to be much more central to development, but indeed even to the policy agenda in developed countries like Canada. And the third message I want to convey is there are formidable job challenges everywhere. The nature of that challenge depends very much on the country context, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But we need to think about job policies very differently, in my view. For all the talk about jobs, when you really deconstruct how policymakers think about jobs, there are two or three general approaches that prevail. One is, and probably the most common, is that jobs are just inevitably the outcome of growth. So really, you don't have a jobs agenda, you have a growth agenda. A second way that policymakers typically think about jobs is in terms of the labor market itself. Are the rules in the labor market the right rules? Do we have the right level of minimum wages? Are the labor laws the right laws? Do we have the right balance in terms of the institutions like unions and collective bargaining? So that's the second way, a labor market-focused view. And the third way is essentially a supply-side view, a human capital view, that the most important thing to do, all you really need to do, is prepare your workforce with the level of skills that is needed, and everything else will fall in place. Now, all of these things are important, and all of them have to be part of a job strategy. But what I'm going to argue is, in fact, a complete job agenda needs to incorporate other things, and many of these things actually are located far outside the labor market and far outside the education system. Now, to get started, let me just talk a little bit about, I'm going to present a few factoids about the jobs challenges worldwide. There's many more things I could put up here, but just a few things to get a sense of the magnitude of the job challenge globally. In order to keep employment rates at the level they are now, and here we're talking worldwide, in other words, for the percentage of the adult population that's employed to remain at today's levels, 600 million jobs are going to have to be created over the next 15 years. So that's a huge number, obviously. That challenge is going to be exacerbated by the fact that tomorrow's workers in most countries are off to a pretty bad start. And we hear a lot about youth unemployment problems in many parts of the world. In fact, over 600 million young people not only are neither working but are not studying either. So these are young people who themselves are not getting a start in life, but also from a social point of view, the next generation of workers is not doing the things or not getting the chance to do the things that will be necessary to become tomorrow's productive workforce. And that workforce is growing dramatically in many parts of the world. So just in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, 10 million new entrants are coming into the labor force every single year. Other parts of the world are facing completely the opposite problem. Countries like Canada, but even more so countries in Europe, Japan, are facing an aging workforce, which creates its own set of challenges. So just simply in terms of the number of jobs being created, the challenge is pretty daunting. Second of all, numbers themselves are not the whole story. We also need to think about the quality of jobs, what it is that people do. And it's important here to understand, and especially when we're thinking about the world of international development and going well beyond the developed countries and thinking about emerging economies and developing economies, the notion of what people do is much broader than simply just working in a wage job or a salaried job. So there are over 3 billion people working today, and only about half of those people are working in jobs that you could describe as a wage job or a salaried job. The other half are in informal sector work, are working in agriculture, are self-employed on a very small level. So this employment profile worldwide is not really one dominated by the kinds of jobs people in this room have, okay? So wage and salary work is only half the story. Informal is almost normal in much of the world. So this creates a lot of challenges that I'm not going to have time to get into today, but the point I want to make here is that numbers matter, but quality of jobs matters a lot as well. Now let me start to unpack some of the points that I made at the beginning of the talk. First of all, I mentioned that jobs are more than what we earn. Certainly, jobs are hugely important for development because it's through work that households get out of poverty. It's through work that people improve their standards of living. So the link with living standards is obvious and the one we think about most often. But it's also through work that productivity improves and societies prosper. As people get better at their jobs, as the process of job creation and job destruction eliminates lower productivity jobs and replaces them with higher productivity jobs. And then there's a social cohesion link that we don't talk about enough in terms of jobs, although it's always in the background in the discussion. And that is, when people work, they have a much closer connection to the societies and the communities in which they live. They have a much stronger sense of social identity, and societies are more cohesive and function better when they have high rates of employment and people are participating economically. So jobs are transformative, not only in an economic sense, but they're transformative in a social sense as well. Now, jobs mean a lot to individuals, and up until now I've really been talking about the notion of the individual value of jobs, the value of jobs to the individual. But from a policy point of view, equally important, and maybe more important, is to think about jobs in terms of their social value. In other words, the worth of the job to the society as a whole. And the individual value of a job and the social value of a job may not always be the same. So think, for example, about some jobs where the individual value may be much higher than the social value. In other words, the contribution to the society that job is giving. And an obvious example could be a drug dealer, where the individual value of that job can often be very high, but the social value is probably quite negative. So this is an example where a wedge exists between the value to an individual versus the value to society. But from a policy point of view, what we're really interested in is jobs that don't have this negative social spillover, but they have a positive social spillover. In other words, jobs that have a particular value to the society itself. And people understand the difference between individual value and social value. As part of the World Development Report, we did some surveys in a number of countries around the world, asking people to assess the value to the individual of certain types of jobs and to assess the value of society to certain types of jobs. And they were always able to do that, and we often found significant differences between that. So, for example, teachers and doctors are examples of jobs where individuals assess the social value as higher than the individual value. But it actually gets more complicated than that, because the social value of the job, and in the report we call this good jobs for development, and that's important. It's not just simply good jobs, but good jobs for development, which makes the link to the social value. What those good jobs for development are can vary very much depending on the country context. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more in a minute, but let's talk a little bit about what these jobs are. So the point I want to make is that some jobs do more for development, or some jobs do more for their society than other jobs. And from a policymaker's point of view, it's important to understand what those good jobs for development are, to understand what the constraints in the society are to creating those good jobs, and then to think about what policy responses might alleviate those constraints. Now, I've put up here some examples of jobs that may do a lot for development. It may have a lot of value for the society that they're in. And I'm not going to have time to go through a lot of these, but let me just give you a couple of examples. Jobs that empower women, for example. There's a lot of research now that shows that when women get jobs, when women get some independent income, the dynamics of how the family functions differs. The bargaining power within the household differs, and it has become well established, for example, now that households where women work tend to have higher levels of investment in their children than households where women don't work, for example. So more money is spent on education, more money is spent on health, for example. So you can see the positive spillover to that kind of situation where in the next generation, the society, not just the individuals and their families, is going to benefit from this greater investment in children that is made when women work. Let's look on the other side. Certain types of jobs may mean a lot more for social cohesion than other types of jobs. So if you think about a post-conflict society, for example, where there are big fissures in the society, where there are people trying to reintegrate back into society after conflict, in those situations, the social cohesion spillovers may be the most important objective, and jobs that reintegrate ex-combatants into society, or jobs that reintegrate displaced populations into society, may be jobs that have a particularly high social value. So the idea here is, yes, jobs have obviously a lot of value to individuals, but they also have the potential for these positive spillovers in the form of higher social value. And from a policy point of view, certainly the number of jobs matters, but the nature of those jobs matter, and depending on the country context, certain types of jobs are likely to have these positive social spillovers. Now, obviously, a lot of this is very country-specific. And what we did in the report was we started to look at different types of country situations. And normally when you do a big global study on something that's done in World Development Reports or the United Nations Human Development Reports, you'll tend to organize countries either by their region, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, so on and so forth, or you might organize countries by their income level, low income, low middle, middle income, high income, for example, and try to do your analysis that way. But what we did in this report was we organized countries in a different way. We organized them according to their natural endowments, their location, the stage of development they were at, their institutional context. And in doing that, we saw that there are very, very different types of jobs challenges that exist around the world. So we organized countries into 8 different types of jobs challenges. So for example, to start at the top of this list, many countries in the world, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, are agrarian societies. Most of the people are still working in agriculture, typically with very, very high rates of subsistence employment, high levels of poverty. And the job challenges for those countries, in other words, the good jobs for development in those countries, largely are ones that have to do with improving living standards, going back to that pillar of that temple that I showed you a couple of slides ago. So since these are very low-income countries, living standards take priority. So jobs that could make smallholder farming more productive, for example, and start to lift families out of the most grinding levels of poverty could be jobs that have very high social value. But these are societies as well that are starting or need to start to move out of subsistence agriculture and into other sectors of the economy. So jobs that start that process of creating urban areas that eventually will be connected to global markets are also jobs that would have very high social value in that context. Give you one more example, countries with high youth unemployment, for example. Here let's think about countries around both sides of the Mediterranean with extremely high unemployment rates. Obviously now not only experiencing significant economic costs because of those very high youth unemployment rates, but also quite potentially serious social costs. We all know about the Arab Spring and the discontent that persists because so many young people are not able to participate economically in their societies and everything that goes with that. Actually, the traditional explanations for those high unemployment rates in countries of Southern Europe and North Africa are that either young people are being educated in the wrong skills, so we need education reform, or another very common explanation is that the labor market rules are far too restrictive and they essentially exclude young people from a chance to participate in society. So those are the kinds of reforms that people think about. But in fact, when you think about these economies and think about Egypt or Tunisia, for example, in fact, there are lots of innovative, dynamic, well-educated young people. The problem is that these economies have become economies of privilege and uncompetitive practices. In Tunisia, before the regime went down, there was one internet company in the country, and it was essentially controlled by the ruling party. So, in fact, education reform and labor market reform is not really what's needed in that situation. It is jobs that start to break down these privileges and these non-competitive practices. So good jobs for development in this context could be jobs that are not allocated, for example, on the basis of networks and connections. Okay? So the context for what good jobs for development are really, really differs, but the argument we're making is that the payoff to society of creating those jobs can be huge. Now let me go to the last part of my presentation and talk about policy. I had mentioned that when you think about standard approaches to job creation, there tend to be two things that people focus on. One is having a strong, growing economy, and the idea being that jobs will follow. And the second is having labor market rules and programs that help people get jobs. Now, these things are important, and in thinking about policy, you need certainly to have the fundamentals, and that is the conditions that are going to create economic growth. Without growth, it's very unlikely you're going to meet your jobs challenge. So that means a stable macroeconomic environment. That means a business climate that's attractive to investors. Another fundamental is a good education and training system that puts people in a position where they can be productive in a modern economy. We also believe that rule of law and respect for rights is an important fundamental, and here I don't want to miss the chance to make the point that core labor standards and the basic human rights of workers as well are a fundamental that countries need in a job strategy. So that's that, and that is necessary, but it's not a sufficient condition for a jobs agenda. The second level is the labor market level, making sure that the labor market functions properly, that the rules and institutions do what they were intended to do without creating too many economic costs for employers that will then reduce labor demand. But it's the third area that I think has not gotten enough attention in terms of thinking about what a real jobs agenda would be. And this is where you deal with this issue of figuring out what good jobs are for development in your country context. In other words, what are the kinds of jobs that are going to have the greatest positive spillover, and then think about what policies might alleviate the constraints on the creation of those jobs. And that will depend very much on the context. And I gave you in the previous slide an example of some different country situations where different types of jobs would be good jobs for development, and that would imply very different policy approaches. In the case of the Middle East and North Africa and the high youth unemployment problem, it would be institutional reform and reforming product markets to make them more competitive. In the agrarian society example I gave you, the most important sectors for reform may well be the agricultural sector and making reforms that will increase productivity and the living standards of smallholder farmers, or perhaps could be urban reforms that start to create functional cities that will allow these countries to start to make the transition into modern economic sectors. So again, the policy sectors in this top part of the pyramid, the most important policy sectors, will depend on the country and will often be far outside the traditional sectors we think about when we think about jobs. So let me start to tie things up now and make 2 points in closing, and I'll be happy to discuss all of this with you. First of all, what I really am trying to do here is make the point that what we're really talking about here is development. I mean, this was a report on jobs, and this is a talk on jobs. But what we're really talking about is development. And that can imply development in low-income and emerging countries, but it also can imply development in a developed country like Canada. And your thoughts about development, I think, start to change a little bit when you look at it through the lens of jobs, which is typically not a lens that people look at for all the talk as they think about development. And the second point I wanted to make is that while the focus of a lot of my remarks, and indeed the focus of the World Development Report, is on developing countries, I think that a lot of these basic arguments are very interesting to think about in the context of a country like Canada, where our job challenges are obviously very different than they are in some of the country contexts I've focused on this morning, but where thinking about the 3 points I've mentioned, that jobs need to be central, and not just in the discourse, but in actual policy thinking, that the recognition of the social value of jobs and their contribution to social cohesion as well as economic goals, and thinking far outside just simple growth models and labor market reforms are necessary for jobs agendas. I think all of these points are interested to consider for countries regardless of their level of development. Anyway, I hope there are some thoughts there, if not big, worth talking about, and I look forward to discussing these with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Betcherman. We have about 20 minutes for questions. Vous avez des micros qui sont dans la salle. C'est le seul microphone? Je vous encourage à utiliser les microphones pour poser vos questions en anglais ou en français. Whatever language you speak in, however, since we're in the parliamentary restaurant, I'm going to impose House of Commons rules. So that means very short questions. I think it's 30 seconds, but I don't have the timer. Also, I'm not the speaker, so I'd ask you to identify yourselves as well for the questions, all right? So while you're getting your thoughts together, I was going to ask, rats. I was going to ask a question, but I've been foiled. All right, off you go.
Away from an open mic. Dennis Bevington, Member of Parliament for the Northwest Territories. I enjoyed your talk because I come from an area where jobs fit into the resource cycle very much. Northwest Territories has the greatest income disparity in Canada, has one of the highest GDP growth rates. Jobs have become very, in some ways, unsettling to social context because many of them are, and this is going to be more and more a pattern in Canada because the resources are further and further away from our communities. So these jobs are fly in and fly out. One thing I didn't hear in your discussion, and I think it's very important, is sustainability. How does society create sustainability in jobs so that jobs in the social context create society, and in our resource-rich country, jobs create the sustainability we need for the social context.
First of all, thank you for the question. I think it's a really important question. First of all, sustainability I think fits in very nicely with this concept of the social value of jobs again, because while jobs may have value to individuals may not be as concerned about sustainability as societies are for the sustainability of their economies and their societies. So I think it's something that is very much in our minds as we wrote the report. The challenges of resource-rich areas are particularly difficult when you think about jobs through development, when you think about development through a jobs lens. And there are many places in the world now where a lot of wealth is being created because of resources, but it's not necessarily translating into the economic and social outcomes that we would want. As many of you know, having a lot of resources is often associated with societies where the distribution of income is really poor, where because of macroeconomic effects, actually it becomes very difficult for other parts of the economy to develop. So there are particular challenges of growth and especially sustainability in an environmental sense in countries that are resource rich. So this is an example of a particular context where you need to think about how you can manage the resource richness and turn it into an advantage, not just for the immediate circle of people who are benefiting from those resources, but also for the broader society. And not very many countries are doing this very well. It involves using the actual wealth generated by the resources, but also being very strategic about how you're going to diversify your economy into sustainable ways that don't harm the environment.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Otto Frost. I'm a research intern at the Council of Canadian Academies, and I tend to do a lot of ad hoc international development work. So I guess I'll quickly get into the question and the context. So the question is, could you elaborate a bit more on the institutional reforms that would be required? You touched on it a bit in the previous answer, but the institutional reforms that would be required to include social development variables more into the labor industry. So, for example, when I do international development work, I work with a lot of young people involved in two different spheres. One is interfaith for development, and one is technology for development. One of them is very sexy, gets a lot of investment because people see the connection to an industry, which is technology for development. However, when interfaith is very much a marginalized part of development, but it does have a high social value. And being in a room full of youth who want to pursue careers in social development and social justice, it doesn't seem viable whatsoever. So what are some of those reforms that would make it necessary to include more social development variables into the labor force as a whole?
Okay. Well, institutional reform is really difficult, but obviously, especially in many developing country contexts, it is the key. Part of what underlies a lot of this is that we don't have good information and we don't disseminate that information. And let me explain what I mean. It's fine for me to talk about the social value of jobs, but what we need to do is to start to develop ways of actually capturing that social value of jobs so that people can make decisions that ultimately will be best for the overall society. And what we don't do very well now is measure activities that have a positive social output. So the kinds of programs that you're talking about do not get much support because if they are in fact producing value for the society, we really have no way of capturing it. So to start with, I think that we need to think about ways to start to be able to measure that and to make the case that there is value for society for that. Because until we can do that, we're essentially arguing on faith in a way. You know what I mean? So we've made a lot of progress in recent years in terms of starting to measure the value of things more broadly than we used to. So many of you will know that there's a lot of innovation going on now in terms of measuring economic output using non-standard measures. People here know about measuring happiness in Bhutan. But we're starting to actually be much better in terms of environmental accounting, but in terms of actually starting to appreciate the value of activities in the social sphere, we're a long way away, but I think that needs to be the starting point for this.
Bonjour, moi c'est Johan Sainton. Je travaille au Conseil de recherche en sciences humaines. Je suis en communication. Actually, I like the way you talked about measurement. I don't know, I'm a new father, so the budget family, I'm calculating money, job, and stuff. So what I like what you're saying is that there are new measures being put in place about how to measure, and the trends that I see is that, and my question will follow later, is that the trend is more on the knowledge, but how to calculate knowledge. Since we've been like past 50 years, like a really strong manufacturing industry that is disappearing because robotics, and now there's a trend with 3D printing. There's a new kind of economy coming up. So what do you think about this idea that appeared like in 1990s about like the guaranteed income allocation, l'allocation de revenus garantis, so that, you know, there's some kind of a knowledge being recognized as a standard so that this new economy would be better pour démarrer, qui serait mieux à démarrer, so that there's like what you're saying about the pillar, about the social benefits to jobs. I wanted to have your thoughts on that.
This guaranteed annual income, the guaranteed annual income that I'm familiar with is kind of having an income floor, a guaranteed income for every household, basically, as a way of reformulating welfare. Is that what you have in mind?
Yeah, because right now, like we work, we get a revenue, we get fiscal, on the fiscality side, there's a tax imposed, but now less standard or traditional way of working, more like advisors and stuff, that people working on their own, but still different way of calculating the way that we pay for this service, but how the government is imposing taxes on this type of work.
Right, okay. You know, regardless of the level of development, what we don't do very well is think about policies outside the box of thinking about work as standard wage and salary job. And everything is based on that. Our tax systems are based on it. Our benefit systems are based on it. Where, in fact, and I showed there are as many people working in non-standard types of work as working in these traditional types of employment. And the formulation of those jobs looks very different depending on the level of development. So for the informal street vendor in a low-income country, that being the deviation from the standard model. In developed countries like Canada, it's more in terms of non-standard work that may be independent consulting, maybe knowledge work that people are doing outside of traditional structures. And in all aspects of public policy, we don't handle that very well. And again, that goes from benefits to taxes to regulations. So when you think about specific job challenges, depending on the country context, for countries like ours, I believe that in fact is one of the main challenges we're going to face, is how do we refashion all of the rules and regulations and benefits to put different types of work on an equal footing, so that we're conceptualizing work much more broadly. And in doing that, I think we will come up with institutions that help people learn throughout their lifetimes, combine work with other forms of activities, including balancing work and family, and so on and so forth. So I think for us, this is a critical job challenge.
So we have 2 more questions?
Hi, a comment and a question. I'm Terry Ann Boyles from Association of Canadian Community Colleges, worked with Gord long ago. Our association, of course, works in the Canadian context on advanced skills for economic and social development, but equally we work worldwide across most of the dimensions that you covered, and certainly the World Development Report is critical to our work internationally. And so the Education for Employment program funded through CETA is one of the elements in a number of countries around the world, and it ties to the economic, social development, social cohesion in those countries. Interestingly, our work in Egypt, Tunisia, and indeed now in Nigeria, Nigeria with CETA, World Bank, etc., are really wanting us to work on the social cohesion and the skills gap for the youth in that area. It might be interesting to do a project, Brent, a SSHRC-funded project that really takes a look at what the Canadian interventions and partnerships have been against the model in the World Development Report. So we'd be interested in exploring them.
That's a comment, right? Okay.
Maybe the question is to Brent, is it possible funding? But so the thing is in the work, and you're just coming back to Canada, is through the Canadian lens and the intervention of the Canadian support mechanisms, either through the trade side or through the development side, what can be done to move it forward.
Right. I think that's certainly worthwhile doing.
Hi, Vincent Hardy. I'm a parliamentary intern, in the office of the Honourable Wayne Easter. I was curious to know how you would see trade liberalization as playing a role in this job creation in developing countries, especially given the fact that the main comparative advantage of those countries is often low-cost labor. So how does that play out into this model of development?
I think liberalization is pretty important. I think that it's hard to find examples of countries that have created a lot of jobs and created good jobs and raised the living standards of their people without liberalizing. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One is that obviously creating external markets will generate economic growth and create jobs in the process. But in a way, that part of it has been oversold. The other part of it that I think is really critical is the transfer of knowledge and learning that happens as countries liberalize, and they start to learn where their niches are, where their comparative advantages are, what the most efficient ways of using their endowments are to prosper and become more developed countries. And if you're not open to the rest of the world, it's really hard for that learning to take place. Now, obviously, there's a lot of caveats to that. I think anybody who's carefully looked at the literature would conclude that the economic benefits of liberalization have been oversold by the advocates of free trade, and I also think that the international trading system has not been designed to benefit many developing countries, but the actual principle of liberalization, if it was properly and fairly implemented, is pretty critical in all of this.
Dr. Betcherman, just one last question on Canada. In terms of that pyramid that we saw with the fundamentals of labor policies and priorities, for a country like Canada, which seems to me fits different parts of those economic categories as we saw, what are the main challenges, and so what are the constraints?
Okay. Yeah, those different categories are not meant to be mutually exclusive, and Canada, like many other countries, certainly fits into a number of categories. When I think about Canada and think about applying this model to Canada, a few things that come to mind are, first of all, dealing with the aging problem, which is something that it's already arriving and it's only going to become more of a pressing concern. And that raises two big challenges. One is, how are we going to provide social protection and health given that context? So we have a particular category looking at aging societies, and social protection and health and providing that becomes the top priority in that context. But another way of dealing with an aging population, but only, it's not a full solution, but a partial solution, is immigrants, migration. And that's always been a big part of the Canadian labor force and is going to have to be probably a more important part in the future as aging takes place. But both to go back to the jargon of the study, both the individual and the social returns to immigration, I think, have been falling in Canada. And we need to, as a country, change that trajectory and move back to where we were before, which was immigrants and their families integrating nicely into the Canadian labor market and getting on a more sustainable social and economic path. And then the third thing, I think, is to deal with, and this is a question that the Member of Parliament asked, is dealing with the resource riches and the imbalances in the country that stem from the resource riches.
Wow, full agenda. Dr. Betcherman, we have a little thank you for you from all of us, but also from Michael Chong, who is our champion, I guess we can call him, the champion, MP representing Haliburton in Ontario, Halton Hills. The idea of this Big Thinking lecture is that we bring you, with your expertise, together with policymakers and decision makers and people who influence public opinion. And so as d'une ouvrière de la connaissance à un autre, from one knowledge worker to another, I'd like to thank you very much for being part of our Big Thinking lecture series. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I just want to remind everyone here that this is the last in our Big Thinking lecture series for the 2012-13 season. We have a new season coming up in the fall. We hope to see many of you back with us. And in the meantime, the big ticket item, I guess, the big part of the agenda is the Congress of Learned Societies, which will be taking place in Victoria at the first week of June, May 31st to June 8th. We have a whole roster of Big Thinking lectures that will be part of that, including Louise Arbour, Danny Weinstock. And so we hope to see many of you at that Congress and again in the fall for our new season. Merci beaucoup. Thank you again.